Hey everyone, welcome back to Legends of the Story. I hope you're doing well tonight, wherever you are, and I hope you're settling into a comfortable spot. Maybe in your bed, maybe on your couch, maybe in that one quiet place you go to when the world feels a little too loud. Here in my Minecraft world, the night has just started to fall. The sky is turning from soft orange to deep blue, and the torches outside my little cabin are flickering gently in the breeze. You can hear the distant sound of water flowing somewhere beyond the trees, and every once in a while, an owl hoots in the forest. Everything feels slow, safe, peaceful. It's the perfect atmosphere for sinking into another long story. Something calm, something steady, something that lets your mind drift without pressure. So, take a deep breath with me. Let your shoulders relax. Let the tension fade from your neck. You made it through another day, and now, this time is yours. No deadlines, no noise, no stress. Just you, this quiet Minecraft night, and the gentle rhythm of a story that will carry you off to sleep. Tonight's story is one of those subtle, satisfying ones, the kind that starts with a quiet frustration, builds into a moment of justice, and ends with that soft, peaceful feeling of balance being restored. It comes from Reddit, of course, a place full of messy human moments, surprising twists, and small victories that somehow feel huge when you hear them at night. But before we jump in, look around the Minecraft world with me for a second. The lantern outside the window is glowing like warm honey. The rain has just begun, that soft, tapping kind that feels like it's calming your heartbeat. My character is sitting beside the fireplace, logs crackling, the room filling with that gentle orange glow that always makes nighttime feel a little safer. This is your quiet space now, your place to unwind. We'll stay here for a while, long enough for your mind to slow down, long enough for sleep to feel close. So, settle in, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want to. Let the ambience wrap around you. And get ready for our first story tonight, a tale about patience, boundaries, and the moment someone finally decides they've had enough of being walked over. This is where a night begins. Tonight's first story begins the moment my Minecraft character steps outside the warm glow of the cabin and hears the gentle rustling of the leaves in the soft evening breeze. And as I walk slowly along the path lit by lanterns, it reminds me of a man named Elias, who once lived a life filled with quiet routines and simple comforts, much like the peaceful rhythm of this pixelated world. And though he was a person of few words, he held a calmness in his spirit that most people found soothing. Someone who worked long hours at the city archives, spent evenings reading old newspapers, and ended almost every night with a cup of herbal tea and a silent moment by his window, watching the streetlights flicker like distant stars, and everything would have remained beautifully ordinary if not for the arrival of his new neighbor, a young man named Jordan who moved into the apartment directly beside him, bringing with him a storm of noise, chaos, and carelessness that slowly turned Elias's peaceful life into a constant battle for rest. It began gently at first, the way disruptions often do, doors closing a little too loudly, furniture scraping against the floor at odd hours, occasional shouting through thin walls, but soon escalated into late-night gatherings, loud music echoing through the hall, drunken laughter spilling across corridors, and the unmistakable thudding of heavy footsteps pacing back and forth at moments when most people would be fast asleep, and Elias tried to handle it the way reasonable people do, by knocking softly on Jordan's door one evening, explaining kindly that he worked early mornings and asking if he could keep the noise down after midnight, to which Jordan smiled politely, said, "Yeah, sure man, no problem." And for one hopeful night, the hallway stayed quiet, but the following evening the chaos returned, louder than before, as if Elias's request had somehow become background noise in the whirlpool of Jordan's restless world. And this continued for weeks, chipping away at Elias's patience until he found himself exhausted at work, losing focus, growing irritable, and clutching his coffee mug like it was the only thing holding him together, And though he filed multiple noise complaints, the building manager, fatigued and understaffed, always responded with the same tired line, "I'll talk to him, Elias, I promise." Yet the man never followed through, leaving Elias suspended in a loop of politely waiting for people to act and watching them repeatedly fail him. And on one especially difficult evening, after a long day of sorting decades-old documents, Elias returned home, hoping for peace, only to find the hallway trembling to the bass of Jordan's speakers, the sound thick and overwhelming like heavy fog, and something inside him finally snapped. Not with anger, but with a strange, deliberate calm. The kind that grows when patience reaches its final thread and snaps so quietly that no one else can hear it. So he went inside, set his keys down with precision, and sat at his kitchen table, thinking not about confronting Jordan or yelling or banging walls, but about a solution that matched his personality, subtle, intelligent, and undeniably effective. And because Elias spent his life surrounded by old archives and obscure research materials, he remembered a document he once handled about sound mapping in residential buildings. A study that mentioned how certain apartment layouts created acoustic pressure. Points, tiny pockets where certain frequencies amplified instead of fading. And as he recalled that information, a quiet idea formed in his mind. One that wasn't loud or cruel, but simply elegant. And over the next few days, he revisited that research online, learning exactly how sound traveled through the structure of his building, and discovered that Jordan's bedroom wall shared a hollow internal cavity with Elias's living room wall, creating the perfect acoustic tunnel for low frequency vibration. And unlike high-pitched sounds that are obvious and sharp, low-frequency sound is a hum, felt more than heard, and known to disturb sleep, create uneasiness, and disorient people in ways they can't quite explain. So after careful thought and a long walk through the city to clear his mind, he purchased a small portable sub-frequency generator, the kind musicians use during concerts to test bass vibration, and placed it against the shared wall, calibrating it to hum at a frequency that wouldn't travel into the hallway or disturb other neighbors, but would seep directly into Jordan's room through the hollow cavity. And at 4:45 a.m. the next morning, while the world lay wrapped in early morning silence, and even Minecraft villages would be asleep, Elias quietly activated the device, letting the low hum fill the wall like a gentle, invisible tide. Within minutes, he heard the faint movements of Jordan stirring, pacing, confused, his sleep clearly disrupted but without any identifiable source. And by the second morning, the pattern repeated. Footsteps, frustration, a soft curse, the sound of someone trying in vain to find the origin of the disturbance. And by the fourth day, it had escalated into loud knocking through the wall, desperate attempts to silence the phantom vibration. And finally, during the fifth day, Elias heard the unmistakable thud of furniture moving, as if Jordan was trying to rearrange his entire bedroom to escape the sensation. And yet, despite all of this, Elias kept his composure, sipping his morning tea, leaving for work well-rested and serene for the first time in months, because the beauty of his approach was that it wasn't revenge driven by spite or malice, just a calculated act of balance, restoring the peace that had been taken from him. And finally, after 2 exhausting weeks for Jordan, the noise stopped completely. No more music, no more parties, no more footsteps at ungodly hours, as if the constant, unexplainable early morning disturbance drained the energy and desire for late-night chaos right out of him. And eventually, just like storm clouds quietly drifting away after a long rainfall, Jordan packed up his things and moved out, muttering to another tenant in the hallway that the apartment had bad vibes and weird shaking in the walls that kept him from sleeping. And once again, silence returned to the building, deep, uninterrupted, blissful silence. And Elias, with a peaceful smile, dismantled the device, stored it carefully in his closet, and returned to his evenings of tea, reading, and soft lamplight, never telling a soul what he had done, Because sometimes the quietest people carry the sharpest wisdom, and justice, when delivered gently and intelligently, can be the most satisfying kind of all, especially on nights like this, where the soft glow of my Minecraft cabin echoes the gentle peace of a life finally restored to balance. And the thing about silence, the kind that settles in after a storm finally passes, is that it gives a person time to notice things they hadn't realized were happening beneath the surface. And that's exactly what Elias began to feel in the days following Jordan's departure. Because as peaceful as the building had become, there was a strange tension lingering like a faint echo, a reminder that the balance he restored had shifted something else in the atmosphere, something subtle enough to ignore. At first, but steady enough that it eventually demanded his attention. It began with small observations. A conversation overheard in the lobby between two longtime residents whispering about weird vibrations in the walls. A late-night email from the building manager mentioning upcoming inspections due to reports of structural humming. And even an elderly neighbor downstairs mentioning she thought she felt her bed shake just a little during the early morning hours, and though Elias knew his device couldn't have affected anyone except Jordan because of the way the internal wall cavities were placed, he couldn't help but feel a slight tightening in his chest, a quiet anxiety reminding him that even the most carefully planned actions can leave ripples that stretch beyond what we intend. But just as he began worrying that his subtle retaliation had drawn too much attention, something else happened. Something that changed the entire rhythm of the building and pulled Elias into a deeper situation than he ever expected. A new tenant moved into Jordan's old apartment, a woman named Lila, who arrived with 2 moving boxes, a small potted plant, and an energy that felt completely different from the chaos that had once filled the hallway. And though Elias typically avoided getting involved in neighbors' lives, there was something about the soft-spoken way she greeted everyone that made him pause, noticing how she seemed both gentle and slightly weary, like someone who had seen her share of difficulties yet still carried kindness like a lantern through a dim room. Still, Elias had no intention of making friends. He preferred quiet evenings and quiet mornings, always keeping to himself. But life has a way of nudging people into connections whether they ask for it or not. And one evening, just as he was locking his door to take out the trash, he heard the sound of muffled crying from somewhere down the hallway. Faint enough to ignore, but clear enough to recognize as someone trying very hard not to be heard. And though he hesitated, his steps slowed instinctively as he followed the soft sound to Lila's door, where he noticed the faint glow of a lamp beneath the frame and realized she was crying quietly inside, and an uneasy feeling settled over him. Not because he wanted to intrude, but because kindness has a way of tugging at the threads we think we've neatly tucked away. He left the trash bag at his side and lightly tapped her door, just once, gentle enough that she could pretend she didn't hear it if she chose. And after a moment, the crying stopped, replaced by silence, so still he wondered if he imagined everything, until the door opened slightly, and Lila peered out with red eyes and a small, apologetic smile, trying to brush off the moment as if tears were nothing more than dust in the air. But Elias, in his quiet way, simply asked if she was all right, not pressing, not prying, just offering the harmless concern of a neighbor. And after a long pause, she nodded and whispered that she was fine, though her trembling voice hinted otherwise, and before he could respond she added, almost as an afterthought, that she was sorry for any noise she might have made, that she hoped she wasn't disturbing anyone. Elias almost laughed at the irony, remembering the chaos Jordan had brought to this same apartment, and assured her softly that no, she wasn't disturbing anyone at all. And with that, she gave a small grateful nod and closed the door gently. But something about the moment lingered in Elias's mind for the next few hours as he tried to read his book, his thoughts circling around the fragility he'd seen in her eyes, the kind that comes from carrying a weight no one else can see. And though he knew nothing about her situation, the quiet part of him, the one that understood exhaustion, frustration, and the longing for peace, felt a pull of empathy he hadn't expected. The next few days unfolded with gentle awkwardness. Lila, keeping mostly to herself, Elias catching brief glimpses of her as she collected mail or returned from work. Her shoulders often slumped, but her smile always polite when she greeted him. And as the building inspections drew closer, he noticed she seemed increasingly nervous, glancing at the walls as if expecting them to betray some secret she desperately didn't want revealed. And it wasn't until exactly 1 week after she moved in that the first major shift in the story occurred. Something small, yet powerful, enough to send Elias down a path he never anticipated. It happened late on a Wednesday evening, when Elias heard a sudden crash from Lila's apartment, loud enough to cut through the quiet of the hallway, but not violent enough to sound like an accident. And before he could talk himself out of getting involved, he found himself knocking gently on her door once again, expecting her to brush him off or apologize the way she had before. But this time, she opened the door with panic in her eyes, holding the broken pieces of a fallen picture frame, and behind her, scattered across the floor, he saw dozens of papers, letters, printed emails, documents, shaken loose from a cardboard box that seemed like it had been knocked off a table. And though she scrambled to explain it away, insisting it was nothing, Elias recognized the look in her eyes. Fear, the same kind that comes from something bigger than a simple accident. Something that follows a person like a shadow, no matter where they go. She said one sentence that made Elias's stomach tighten. "I just moved here to feel safe again." And though she didn't explain further, the words carried weight, enough that Elias suddenly understood why she flinched at hallway footsteps and why she stayed awake late into the night with a lamp on. This wasn't simply a woman starting a new chapter. This was someone escaping something. Someone hoping the walls of this old building could shield her from a past that still lingered like static in the air. And for the first time in years, Elias felt that familiar tug again. The quiet instinct to protect, to balance, to restore peace the same way he had for himself. But this time, it was different because the threat wasn't noise or disruption. It was something human, something emotional, something invisible. And as he knelt to help gather the scattered papers, he noticed one of them. A printed message on cheap paper with the words, "You can't ignore me," forever written across the top. And in that instant, Elias realized the calm of his building was about to be tested once more. But not by noise or chaos from careless neighbors. This time, the disturbance came from a past that refused to stay buried. And as he handed the paper back to Lila, their eyes met for a brief, quiet moment that said more than either of them dared to speak aloud, marking the beginning of a new chapter neither of them was prepared for, yet both were already deeply entangled in. And little did Elias know, this story, unlike Jordan's, would demand more than cleverness or quiet retaliation. It would require courage, patience, and a kind of justice far more personal than he had ever delivered before. That night, long after Elias returned to his apartment and set the last of Lila's scattered papers back in her hands, he found himself lying awake in the dim amber glow of his bedside lamp, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows of the window blinds drifted like slow-moving tides, and he realized he hadn't felt this kind of uneasy awareness in years, an awareness that something was happening just beyond the edges of calm. Like a distant storm forming on a horizon he'd hoped would remain clear. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his business, that he'd already gotten involved more than he should, but the sentence he'd read on that printed message, those 5 haunting words, "You can't ignore me forever," looped in his mind like a slow echo, carrying a tone of possessiveness that made his chest tighten, because he'd seen that kind of darkness before in someone else's life. And knowing how deeply it could burrow into a person's sense of safety made him feel a heaviness that sleep couldn't soften. Early the next morning, just as the skyline began to lighten behind the thin curtains, Elias found himself at his kitchen counter, staring into a mug of cooling coffee while replaying the evening in his mind. Not just the crash of the picture frame or the panic in Lila's eyes, but the subtle way her hands trembled as she gathered the papers. as though she was trying to hold together pieces of a life that had cracked long before she ever stepped foot into this building. And that image stuck with him throughout the day like an imprint, a silent reminder that sometimes the battles people fight are invisible until something small, like a fallen frame, reveals just how fragile the balance really is. Over the next few days, the building fell into a strange, delicate rhythm. The halls remained quieter than ever, footsteps muffled, doors gently opening and closing, as if the entire structure itself sensed the tension beneath Lila's calm facade. And though she tried to go about her days normally, greeting neighbors with soft smiles, keeping her apartment tidy, watering the plant she'd placed by her kitchen window, Elias could see the small signs of strain whenever he crossed paths with her, the way her eyes darted to the stairwell whenever she returned from work, the way she double-checked her door lock even after twisting it twice, the way she seemed startled whenever someone called her name from behind. And each time he noticed these things, he felt that same tug of protective instinct pulling at him, urging him to pay attention, to be present in case something deeper began to surface. The shift came on a late Friday evening, when Elias stepped into the laundry room to switch over his clothes and found Lila sitting on the small wooden bench near the dryer, her elbows on her knees, her phone in her hands, staring at the screen with a look so hollow and resigned that he stopped mid-step, sensing something was terribly wrong before she even spoke. She didn't notice him at first, didn't hear the creak of the door or the soft roll of the laundry basket wheels, because her attention was locked onto whatever message or image glowed on her phone. And it wasn't until she felt his presence nearby that she startled slightly and quickly pressed the phone against her chest, wiping at her cheek as if hoping he hadn't seen the tear she just brushed away. But Elias wasn't the type to pretend not to notice pain. Instead, he sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving respectful space between them, and gently asked, in that calm, steady voice of his, if someone had contacted her again. And the way her breath caught, ever so slightly, answered the question even before she whispered yes, with a tremor that made Elias feel a small flare of anger beneath his ribs. She didn't show him the phone at first, just stared at it, gripping it tightly with both hands, as if the device itself carried some toxic heat. But after a long, fragile pause, she tilted the screen in his direction and revealed a text message sent earlier that afternoon, a message that made Elias's stomach twist the moment he read it. "Moving won't save you. I know where you are." The simplicity of the words was chilling, not because of anything graphic or explicitly threatening, but because of the implication, the entitled certainty, the obsessive tone woven into each letter, the way the sender believed her life was still something he had access to, a possession rather than a person. And as Elias handed the phone back to her quietly, he noticed how her hands trembled harder now, her breath shallow, her composure slipping like wet sand between fingers. And though she tried to force a smile, to brush it off as something she just needed to ignore, Elias knew exactly what she was doing. She was minimizing her fear the way people do when they've spent too long being told that their pain is an overreaction. Gently, he asked if this person, the sender, was someone from her past, someone who knew her well enough to track her down, and though she didn't give him the full story yet, she nodded with a defeated kind of sadness, the kind that comes from a history of trying to escape a shadow that keeps stretching no matter how far you run. She told him, in a voice that cracked halfway through, that she had moved 3 times already in the last year, each time hoping to outrun the persistent messages, the unwanted appearances, the sense of being watched or followed, even in places she thought were safe. And though she had gotten temporary quiet each time, it never lasted. Her peace always shattered the moment this person found a way to reach her again, and Elias felt an ache in his chest as he listened, because he knew what fear like that could do to a person's life, how it could make ordinary days feel like battlefields and nighttime feel like a fragile space where every sound becomes a potential threat. He didn't interrupt her, didn't push her for more details, Simply let her speak at her own pace the way he wished someone had done for him years ago when he'd gone through his own quiet nightmares. And when she finally fell silent, exhausted from explaining pieces of a story she clearly wasn't ready to fully unravel, Elias placed a hand gently on the bench between them, close enough to show he wasn't going anywhere, far enough not to overwhelm her, and told her softly that she wasn't alone here, not in this building, not while he was around. The words surprised even him, because he hadn't expected to feel this protective so quickly, but something about Lila, her quiet resilience, her exhaustion, her longing for simple safety, had stirred something in him he thought he'd let fade long ago. And as she nodded with a grateful, shaky breath, Elias felt a shift inside himself, a kind of resolve settling in, a determination he hadn't felt since the days before he'd withdrawn from the world to live quietly in the shadows of routine. The next few days became an unspoken alliance between them. Elias kept an ear open for unusual sounds in the hallway. Lila gradually grew more comfortable around him, and though neither of them said it outright, there was a sense of comfort in knowing someone else was aware of the storm she carried with her. But the peace, however delicate, was short-lived because on the fifth night after their encounter in the laundry room, Elias was awoken at exactly 2:17 a.m. by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, not the hurried steps of a neighbor returning late or the soft shuffles of someone letting their dog out, but the kind of cautious, measured walking that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He stayed still for a long moment, listening, his breathing quiet, and when he heard a soft knock, 3 gentle taps, on Lila's door, followed by complete silence, Elias felt his heart drop into a cold, steady beat, because he knew immediately, instinctively, that whoever stood in that hallway wasn't a resident and wasn't someone who belonged there at all. As the desert wind picked up and carried thin ribbons of sand across the abandoned highway, Aaron pushed forward with a determination that felt heavier than his backpack, heavier than the uncertainty of this strange journey he hadn't meant to begin. Every sound seemed louder now. The creaking of metal from the ruined gas station, the low moan of wind tunneling through broken signposts, even the soft crunch of sand beneath his boots, all of it blending together in a lonely soundtrack that followed him as he crossed the threshold in what the old sign had called District H, a place the map had marked with nothing but a blank patch of faded yellow, almost as if someone intentionally erased whatever used to be here. He could feel a subtle shift in the air, like an unspoken warning, but curiosity tugged at him harder than fear, especially after hearing that strange metallic whisper earlier that had sounded eerily like someone calling his name, though he still tried to convince himself it was only the wind playing games with his tired mind. As he walked deeper into the abandoned streets, he began noticing small details that made the hairs on his arms stand. Paper scattered across the ground that hadn't fully decayed, a pair of dusty glasses left on a shop counter as though their owner stepped away only minutes ago, and a string of dim lights hanging over a restaurant doorway that flickered faintly despite there being no electricity for miles. Each clue painting a picture of a town that didn't fall apart slowly, but instead had been swallowed suddenly, as if time itself paused mid-moment. And yet, the strangest part was the silence, because even in isolation there should have been the distant hum of insects, the buzz of wind hitting structures, some kind of natural ambience. But here it was like everything held its breath. Aaron stepped into a narrow alley where the ground was cracked beneath his boots, and the walls were covered with oddly symmetrical carvings, spirals, arrows, symbols that looked hand-drawn, yet impossibly precise. And he traced his fingers along one of them, feeling grooves that were deeper than they appeared, almost as if carved by something very sharp, very deliberate. When he stepped back, he realized the carvings on both walls formed a pattern that looked like an eye, and for a moment he felt watched, not by a person, but by the place itself. He swallowed hard, told himself he needed rest, and continued walking until he reached the old municipal building whose rusted doors hung crookedly. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with the scent of parchment and dust, and something metallic he couldn't quite identify, and the faint echo of his footsteps bounced off marble floors that should have been cracked, but instead were surprisingly intact. At the center of the lobby, he spotted a circular desk where a single, untouched notebook sat open, its pages stiff yet blank except for one sentence scrawled in hurried handwriting near the top. "Don't let them notice you." Aaron froze, reading the words again and again, feeling a drip of cold slide down his spine as if someone had traced a finger there. He listened, really listened, and for the first time since entering the town, he heard a sound that did not come from him. The soft, unmistakable tapping of footsteps from the second floor, slow and measured, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there already knew he had arrived. His breath shallowed, but instead of running, he found himself stepping carefully toward the grand staircase that spiraled upward, drawn by a mixture of dread and an overpowering need for answers. Each step made the old wood groan beneath his weight, and with every creak, the footsteps above ceased, then resumed, as if mirroring his pace, waiting for him. When he reached the landing, he noticed a long corridor lit by a single flickering emergency bulb, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally far across the walls. At the very end stood a door that was slightly ajar, and behind it he heard a faint hum, soft, rhythmic, mechanical, like the quiet purr of a machine waking from sleep. Aaron pushed the door open and was met with a room filled with outdated computers, all dead except one old monitor glowing with a pale green tint, displaying a single file labeled for the last visitor. Before he could touch it, the tapping footsteps stopped entirely, replaced by a low, slow inhale from somewhere behind him. Not human, not angry, but curious. And as he turned, the shadows on the wall shifted in a way that made his heart slam against his ribs. He stepped backward instinctively, bumping into the desk and accidentally clicking the file open. The monitor filled with strange diagrams, maps of the district, and lines of code he didn't understand, but one phrase repeated again and again across the bottom of the screen like a warning drumbeat. "It knows you're here." The hum grew louder now, pulsing like a heartbeat that wasn't his, and the shadow in the hall stretched toward the doorway, reaching, almost touching, and in that moment Aaron understood he wasn't wandering into a forgotten town. He was walking into something that was waiting, watching, learning him, and as the screen flashed and the lights flickered violently, he heard a whisper, unmistakable this time, right next to his ear, "Don't move." Aaron froze where he stood, every muscle locked in place, as that whisper, soft, cold, impossibly close, coiled around him like an invisible hand gripping the back of his neck. And for a long moment he didn't even breathe, afraid that the slightest movement would trigger whatever was lingering just beyond his vision. The shadow stretching across the hallway seemed to pulse, almost as if responding to the flickering light, and with its slow, unnatural elongation, Aaron felt a pressure in the air. Shift, something tightening, as though the entire building inhaled with him and was waiting to decide whether he was threat or prey. He listened for footsteps, but heard none, only the steady low hum of the machinery in the room, syncing strangely with the pounding in his chest, each vibration vibrating through the soles of his boots as if trying to draw him deeper, urging him toward the glowing monitor that still repeated the same phrase over and over. "It knows you're here." He forced himself to glance at the screen, just enough to catch a glimpse of new lines of text that hadn't been there seconds earlier. "If you want to survive, follow the corridor. Do not look back." His heart stuttered, panic threatening to surge through him, but something inside him, instinct or desperation, pushed him forward. He moved in the smallest, slowest steps, feeling the air thicken behind him, sensing a presence slide along the edges of the room like smoke searching for cracks. But he kept his eyes forward and his breath shallow as he slipped through the doorway and back into the dim corridor. The emergency bulb overhead flickered once, twice, then steadied with a faint buzz, and in that thin strip of light he saw the dust on the floor disturbed by two sets of tracks. His own, and another pair that didn't belong to shoes but is something with long, narrow feet that dragged lightly across the tiles, almost gliding, and they were fresh, as though whatever made them had passed only moments before he arrived. He swallowed the rising terror and followed the hallway as the note instructed, his steps quiet and controlled even as he felt something behind him shift, almost dragging across the ground as if crawling or pulling itself along the wall. He wanted to look back so badly his eyes watered from the effort of keeping them forward, but the warning echoed in his mind like a scream waiting to break. Do not look back. He reached the end of the corridor where the walls opened into a wide archive room filled with towering shelves that leaned slightly under the weight of old files and binders, and a single lantern, battery-powered, dim but still alive, sat flickering on a desk as if placed there intentionally for him. Papers were scattered across the surface, and at the very top lay a photograph that made his breath hitch, a blurry image of the same municipal building, but years earlier, still intact, with a group of workers standing out front. One of them circled in red ink, a tall man whose face had been completely scratched out until only the outline of his head and coat remained. Next to the photograph, in hurried handwriting, someone had scrawled, "He didn't disappear. He changed." Aaron picked up the photo with trembling fingers, and as he did, he heard a soft, dragging sound behind him. Closer now, slow and rhythmic, as though something was pulling itself inch by inch across the floor. Fear spread through him like ice, rooting him to the spot, but he forced himself to move toward the far exit, clutching the lantern in one hand while keeping his eyes fixed ahead. The dragging sound grew louder, and this time he could hear breathing with it. Raspy, uneven, too deep to be human, and then a faint knock, knuckle-like but distorted, tapping the floor behind him twice, slowly, deliberately, as if announcing its arrival. The exit door was only a few steps away, but his legs felt heavy, stiff, as though the building itself resisted letting him go. He staggered forward and pushed against the metal handle, but the door didn't budge at first, scraping against a warped frame until, with a painful groan, it finally gave way just enough for him to squeeze through. As soon as he slipped out, the lights behind him flickered violently, and for the first time, he heard it speak, not a whisper this time, but a low, guttural sound that almost resembled speech, repeating something in a language he didn't recognize, each syllable wet and broken, crawling under his skin like cold water. He stumbled into the stairwell beyond the door, leaning against the concrete wall as he fought to steady his breathing, clutching the lantern tightly. The stairwell spiraled downward into darkness, but he had no choice. Whatever was upstairs was now fully awake, aware of him, and seemed to be following with slow, deliberate patience. He descended the stairs as quickly as he dared, each step echoing faintly, forming a trembling rhythm against the deep, dragging sound above that followed him at its own unhurried pace. By the time he reached the ground floor, the air felt colder, almost damp, and a strange fog clung low to the floor, even though all windows had been shattered long ago. Aaron stepped into the fog, the lantern's weak glow cutting only a small bubble of visibility around him, and across the room he could see an exit sign flickering above a broken double door, hanging by a single hinge. He walked toward it, slower this time, sensing movement in the fog as though something brushed lightly past his shins, disappearing before he could react. The dragging sound had stopped completely now, replaced by a silence so sharp it made his ears ring. When he reached the exit, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the cold metal handle, because although freedom lay on the other side, part of him felt there was still something inside the building he needed to understand, something connected to the photograph, the symbols, the message on the computer. But the moment his hand touched the door, a soft whisper rose from the fog at his feet, not threatening this time, but pleading, a barely audible, fractured voice saying, "Don't leave me." Aaron froze, realizing the voice wasn't the same one that warned him earlier. This one sounded weak, broken, almost human, and when he looked down, he saw the fog swirl into the faint outline of fingers reaching toward him before dissolving again into smoke. His heart twisted with confusion and fear, and before he could decide whether to stay or run, the lights overhead flickered violently, and from above, from the stairwell he had just ascended, he heard the first loud, unmistakable sound of something moving quickly, too quickly, coming straight down toward him. Aaron froze where he stood, the old wooden floor cold beneath his boots, as that heavy, deliberate thud echoed down the stairs, so steady and slow that each step felt like a countdown written into the air itself. And for a moment, he wasn't sure if the sound was real or if his exhausted mind was warping the silence into something threatening. But the vibration that rippled faintly through the narrow hallway told him it was no imagination. The creature, or whatever force, had whispered his name. Upstairs was descending, and he could almost feel the weight of its attention like a hand on the back of his neck. He backed away one careful step at a time, breath shallow, heart hammering against his ribs, ears straining for every shift in the air, and as he moved toward the doorway that led back to the kitchen, the faintest flicker of movement caught the edge of his vision. No shape, no form, just a ripple, like heat distortion or the shimmer of water seen through glass, sliding past the stairwell shadows. He didn't dare blink as the sound of the steps paused, as if the creature had stopped halfway down, listening for him, tasting his fear, calculating something in the dimness. And Aaron felt the old instinct of survival rise in his chest, that deep animal urge to flee, to run. But he also knew that running blindly in a place like this, full of broken floors, hidden holes, rusted metal, and whatever else lurked in the dark, might get him killed faster than staying still. So he forced himself to breathe quietly as the silence stretched impossibly long, like the building was holding its breath with him. Then, in the quiet, he heard it again, a voice, the same whisper from the attic, but softer this time, like it was being dragged through gravel. "Aaron, don't move." And the moment he heard it, a cold wave rolled down his spine because the voice was no longer coming from above, but from directly behind him. So close it felt like the words brushed the back of his ear. Yet, when he slowly turned his head, there was nothing there. Only the faded wallpaper peeling in long curls from the wall and the smell of damp wood. The steps on the staircase resumed, slower now, more cautious, as if the creature was searching the air for him, and Aaron slipped backward into the kitchen doorway, keeping his movements tiny and controlled, listening to the house shift like an old ship on water. And in that dim room, he spotted something new, illuminated by the faint moonlight pushing. Through the cracked window, another carving, this one etched deep into the side of a fallen cabinet, messy and frantic, the lines overlapping like someone had been carving it in a panic. "Run when it stops looking," the words jagged and uneven, as if carved by shaking hands, and below them a symbol he hadn't seen before, a circle with 6 slanted lines radiating out like a cracked sun. He stared at it, trying to understand, when the footsteps above suddenly stopped, all at once, as if whatever was descending had turned sharply toward something or someone. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy in a way that felt almost too deliberate, like the creature was waiting for him to make a mistake, like it had paused, not because it lost sight of him, but because it wanted him to reveal himself. And Aaron crouched low behind the overturned table, every muscle trembling as he tried to steady his breath. And then he heard it, a slow inhale, not human, not natural, deep and wet, coming from the exact place he had been standing not 30 seconds before, followed by something dragging gently across the floorboards near the hall, like claws tracing patterns he wasn't meant to see. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat, gathering every ounce of courage he had left, and as the dragging sound crept deeper into the house, Aaron realized 2 things at once. First, the creature wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was tracking him, drawing closer with intent. And second, the whispers weren't from the creature at all, but from something else hidden in the dark, something trying desperately to keep him alive. And as that understanding settled cold and sharp inside him, he knew that whatever came next would test him in ways he had never imagined. Aaron stayed crouched behind the overturned table, his heartbeat thudding so loudly in his ears he worried the creature might hear it. And for a moment he tried to convince himself that the gentle sway of the shadows in the hallway was just from the drifting wind outside, just the moon dancing through broken glass. But deep down he knew better. There was a presence in that narrow corridor, a weight that made the air thicker and colder in a way no breeze ever could. And as the long, dragging sound crept closer, the boards creaking under that slow, deliberate movement, Aaron pressed himself flatter against the floor, trying to quiet his breath without suffocating, feeling the sharp splinters bite into his palms, grounding him in the terrifying reality of the moment. He counted the seconds between each sound. 1, 3, another drag, soft but unmistakable. And with every inch the creature moved toward the kitchen, the chill inside him deepened, threading through his ribs like icy vines. Then, unexpectedly, the noise stopped again, abruptly, as if the creature had lifted whatever limb it had been pulling across the floor, and the entire house seemed to exhale in that moment. The wind outside shifting, the old beams settling with a groan, but none of those sounds could hide the soft, low exhale that followed, the creature breathing, sniffing the air, tasting for him. Aaron didn't dare move, not even enough to adjust the pain growing in his knees, and the stillness stretched so painfully long that he almost convinced himself he'd imagined the earlier warning whispers, almost believed he was truly alone with that thing now, until he heard the soft brush of something passing along the kitchen doorway, like fingers. Far too many fingers, trailing across the wood, tapping lightly, as if counting or testing the texture, and Aaron's entire body shivered uncontrollably. He pressed a hand to his mouth not to scream, but to hold an involuntary gasp rising from his chest, and when he dared look up just slightly, he saw a shape pass by the doorway, barely visible, a ripple in the air rather than a body, bending light like heat does above summer road. But this distortion was darker, heavier, like a hole cut into the world itself. The shape paused, hovering near the table he hid behind, and Aaron swore he felt its attention slide across him like a cold hand pressing against his skin. Then silence. Not the comforting kind he once knew in his cabin, but a dead, unnatural stillness, like the world had been shoved into slow motion. Aaron waited, every muscle locked. And in that vacuum of sound he became aware of something new, a soft vibration through the floorboards, faint but steady, coming not from the creature, but from somewhere deeper in the house, beneath the kitchen, almost like a hum or a pulse. And with it came another whisper, this time clearer than before, drifting up from the floorboards themselves, slipping between them like a breeze. Down, go down. And although fear surged hot through his veins, he knew the voice had saved him once already. He let his eyes drift toward the trapdoor he had noticed earlier, half covered by broken pottery and dust, the hinges rusted but still intact, and he knew that if he wanted any chance of survival, he needed to reach it without drawing the creature's attention. But just as he shifted the smallest bit, a loose shard of ceramic snapped under his boot, the sound impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. The creature reacted instantly. The air in the hallway twisted inward, like the entire world inhaled at once, and Aaron felt the pressure drop as a distorted, almost human growl vibrated through the walls. The shape surged back toward the doorway, its movement unnatural and wrong, as though reality had forgotten how to animate it. Aaron had no time left to think. He lunged for the trapdoor, fingers slipping on the dusty handle as he wrenched it upward just enough to squeeze through, and he dropped into the darkness below, pulling it down behind him just as something heavy slammed against the other side, making the wood bow inward with a deep, splintering crack. He hit the ground hard, air blasting from his lungs, but even through the pain he heard it. The creature scraping across the trapdoor above him, testing, pushing, snarling in a voice that felt like broken metal grinding together. And somewhere in that chaos, the whisper came again, now from the darkness behind him, soft and urgent. "Move, now." And Aaron, trembling and half-blind, forced himself to his feet, knowing whatever waited in the depths below might be his only chance of escaping the nightmare closing in from above. Aaron stumbled through the darkness beneath the trapdoor, the confined space pressing in around him like a weight he could almost feel on his shoulders, each movement sending fine clouds of dust into the air that smelled of mold and rust and old stone. And as he groped along the damp wall to steady himself, he realized the passage was much larger than he had expected, sloping downward like a forgotten service tunnel, with occasional broken beams overhead that creaked ominously with every tiny shift. The faint glow of moonlight filtering through cracks above barely reached this depth, forcing him to rely on his lantern, which cast long, trembling shadows that danced across the rough walls in ways that made him jump despite himself, and the low hum of something far below echoed through the tunnel like the heartbeat of the building itself, constant, unyielding, guiding him forward as if the house had a mind, a plan, and a rhythm that it expected him to follow. He kept his steps deliberate, careful not to make a sound, and every so often he thought he could feel the floor vibrate beneath his boots, faintly at first, then more pronounced, like the approach of something alive, waiting for him to falter, waiting for a single misstep to betray his presence. After what felt like hours, though it had likely only been minutes, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, the walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves stacked with dusty boxes, long-forgotten furniture, and broken electronics that hummed faintly as though some residual energy still lingered in their circuits. And at the center of the room lay a large, circular stone platform, etched with symbols that seemed to pulse under the flickering lantern light. Symbols similar to those Aaron had seen carved into the walls of the municipal building above, spirals and lines overlapping, chaotic yet intentional, forming a pattern that seemed to expand and contract like it was breathing. As he stepped closer, his eyes caught something moving in the far corner of the chamber, a shadow that shifted without sound, morphing from one shape to another like smoke trapped in a glass. And for a moment, he could swear it had eyes that glowed faintly, red and deep, reflecting back the dim lantern light, and a cold, wet smell filled his nostrils, the kind of scent that makes the stomach clench and the throat dry. Yet there was something hypnotic in it, drawing him closer despite the gnawing, terror crawling across his skin. He forced himself to focus on the stone platform, remembering the message on the monitor upstairs, the photograph, the whispers. Everything had led him here. And as he stepped onto it, the air shifted sharply, warmer somehow, thick and heavy, and the hum beneath his feet changed pitch as though responding to his presence, vibrating through his bones and making his teeth rattle softly. From the corner of the chamber, the shadow started moving toward him, slow, deliberate, but with an unnatural grace, gliding across the floor as if it didn't obey gravity or time. And Aaron felt his breath catch in his throat, muscles tightening, yet he didn't run. He couldn't, not yet, not when he sensed that whatever it was testing him, gauging his resolve. A whisper rose again, clearer than before, from the very stone beneath his feet, soft but commanding. Look at it, face it, understand it. Aaron swallowed, forcing himself to turn his gaze toward the advancing shadow. And in that instant, he noticed something terrifying and mesmerizing. The shape was not fully corporeal, but its movements mirrored the gestures of the missing man from the photograph upstairs, the one with the scratched-out face, and a part of him recognized, instinctively, that this thing was tied to the history of this place, a manifestation of whatever had consumed the town years ago, a guardian, a prisoner, or perhaps both. The floor trembled under his boots as the shadow reached the edge of the platform, pausing, and though it did not speak, a strange sound emanated from it, a low vibration, almost musical, echoing in harmony with the hum of the chamber, resonating deep within Aaron's chest and sending chills down his spine. And yet, amid the fear, he felt an undeniable pull, a compelling need to step closer, to interact, as if the whisper beneath the stones and the shadow itself were guiding him toward a revelation he was not ready for, but could not resist. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted one hand, and the shadow responded in kind, stretching a tendril-like limb toward him, not violently, not threatening, but almost inquisitive, brushing the air just past his fingertips, and the chamber seemed to sigh with the movement, the hum in the walls rising and falling, almost in applause or recognition. Aaron's mind raced. Was this creature sentient? Was it aware of him as an individual, not just an intruder? He stepped fully onto the platform now, knees shaking, and the whisper came again, insistent. Remember, it began with you. It ends with you. The words made no literal sense at first, but Aaron felt the weight of them as though something he had done, or would do, was intrinsically tied to the fate of this entire building, this trapped town, this shadowy guardian. And then the lantern flickered violently, casting the room into near-total darkness for a heartbeat. And in that moment of blackness, the shadow surged forward, enveloping the platform, not attacking, but surrounding him, and Aaron realized that whatever was here was not meant to harm him. It wanted something else, some acknowledgement, some recognition, some connection he could not yet comprehend. And as his lungs burned from holding back a scream of fear and awe, he felt the vibrations in the platform synchronize with his heartbeat, slow and steady, like a dangerous lullaby designed to keep him alive but aware, alive but on edge, alive but learning. Time seemed to stretch impossibly as he stood there, the shadow enveloping him in darkness, and yet letting him see, letting him feel the immense weight of history, of the lost town above, of the missing people, of the mysteries etched into every wall, every symbol, every line of code he had glimpsed. And though terror pulsed through him like electricity, he also felt an overwhelming sense of destiny, that he was exactly where he needed to be, that everything that had happened, the voices, the whispers, the shadows, the warnings, the chase, had led to this singular, incomprehensible moment. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadow began to shift, reshaping itself into something vaguely human, vaguely familiar, as though it remembered a face that time had forgotten, and the whispers became a single voice, audible now, resonant and clear in the chamber, saying, "If you truly want to survive, you must step forward without fear, and you must understand what you carry inside you, or the town will take it all." Aaron's knees buckled as he absorbed the weight of the words, the significance of the moment, and as he lifted his lantern higher, casting a weak but steady glow over the shadow now fully stretched around the platform. He realized that nothing about this place was accidental, nothing about the warnings or the whispers or the shadows was random, and that the only way to escape and to understand was to embrace the unknown completely, to step into the darkness, to confront what had haunted the town, to face the history, the energy, and the entity itself, even if it meant never seeing daylight again. Aaron's legs trembled as he stood at the center of the stone platform, the shadow now fully encircling him like a living barrier of darkness and movement. And though he could barely breathe, he forced himself to lift his lantern higher, the weak glow revealing the intricate carvings beneath his feet that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the shadow's shifting form. The whispers that had guided him here rose again, not from one direction, but all around him, echoing off the chamber walls in soft, overlapping tones, words unintelligible yet unmistakably urging him onward, urging him to move, to understand, to claim the knowledge that the building and everything it contained seemed to demand. And with each step he took, following the invisible rhythm, He felt the weight of centuries pressing in, the lives lost in this place, the secrets buried beneath decades of dust, shadow, and neglect, all converging into this singular moment. The shadow stretched taller, thinner, and then shorter, wider, as though it were testing him, measuring his courage, trying to determine whether he was truly ready for what lay ahead. And Aaron realized with a jolt that this entity, this guardian or prisoner of the building, was tied not just to the structure, but to the very energy of everyone who had ever passed through it, every whispered secret, every scream, every betrayal, every act of courage or cowardice left behind in the walls and floors, all coalescing into this living, breathing presence that now surrounded him. He stepped forward slowly, his boots brushing against the carved symbols on the platform, and with each motion, the shadow seemed to shift in response, as though his very understanding of fear and patience, hope and desperation, was being reflected back at him in real time, a silent test of whether he could hold himself steady, whether he could endure the psychological and spiritual weight of what this place demanded. The temperature around him dropped slightly, an icy draft threading through the chamber that made his hair stand on end, and the faint scent of earth, decay, and metal mixed into a heavy perfume that filled his lungs with every breath. Yet despite the fear and discomfort, there was a compelling undercurrent, a sense that if he hesitated too long, he might miss a crucial step, that the rhythm, the whisper, the shadow itself might shift away, leaving him stranded in darkness, alone with the weight of the chamber pressing down, unrelenting, inevitable. Then, from somewhere deep in the back of the room, he heard the softest sound of movement, not heavy or dragging, but delicate, almost like footsteps on soft moss, though there was no visible path, no floor to support it. The shadow responded instantly, pulsing, stretching, and the whispers converged, forming a low, sonorous hum that resonated inside his chest. A vibration so deep it felt like it was rewriting the very air around him. He pressed forward, following the instinct that had guided him here, and each symbol on the floor seemed to flare faintly under the lantern light, as though alive, as though the chamber itself acknowledged his presence, granting him permission to advance while testing the depth of his courage. Aaron's mind spun with questions. What had happened here? Who, or what, had created this network of shadows, whispers, and carvings? How did it tie into the missing people from the town above, the photographs, the scratched-out faces, the messages he had found? And yet, despite the fear, despite the cold pressing in from the walls, despite the soft, haunting hum of the shadow wrapping around him, he felt something else, a strange sense of calm, of inevitability, as though all the terror, all the danger, was part of a plan, a careful choreography designed to lead him somewhere he couldn't yet see but needed to reach. Step by careful step, he moved toward a low archway on the far side of the chamber, a passageway that appeared to descend further into the earth, darker than anything he had traversed so far, and as he approached, the whispering became a single, coherent phrase. Embrace it, or lose it all. The weight of the words sank into him like lead, heavy and undeniable, and he understood in that moment that what awaited him beyond the archway was not just the entity, not just the history, not just the mystery, but a choice, a test, a confrontation with forces he could neither fully comprehend nor anticipate. His hand rested on the rough stone of the archway, fingertips trembling, and the shadow pulsed one last time. A slow, rolling wave that seemed to wrap around him completely, then contract, drawing itself back toward the center of the chamber, leaving him alone with the faint hum of the cymbals, the soft echo of the whispers, and the pressing anticipation of what was to come. He could feel the pulse of the chamber under his boots, like the heartbeat of the building itself, steady, insistent, urging him forward. He inhaled deeply, gathering every ounce of courage, every memory of fear overcome, every lesson in patience, and stepped into the archway, and immediately the darkness swallowed him, thick and heavy, yet within it he could sense the same rhythm, the same vibration, as though the shadow had followed him, retreating only to allow him passage, guiding him deeper into the unknown. The passage curved downward in a spiral, walls slick with condensation, the air colder, denser, almost tactile, pressing against him, and somewhere in the distance, a faint light glimmered, steady but soft, like a beacon or a promise. Aaron walked toward it, each step measured, careful, heart pounding, knowing that the light represented both hope and danger, safety and judgment, and the shadows above seemed to pulse in synchrony with his approach. A reminder that he was not alone, that every step was observed, recorded, tested. Hours might have passed, or only minutes. Time had no meaning here, and the air grew warmer, less oppressive, carrying with it a faint scent of earth and water, a sign that he was nearing something vital, something central to the mystery that had haunted the building. And just as he rounded a curve in the spiral, the light became brighter, revealing the end of the passage, a small chamber partially submerged in shallow, cold water, with the walls etched in symbols that mirrored those on the platform above. And in the center, something enormous stirred in the water, dark and impossible to see fully, yet unmistakably alive, the source of the whispers, the hum, the shadow. And Aaron knew in the core of his being that he had finally reached the heart of the building's secret, the core of the entity, and that whatever he did next would determine not just his fate, but the fate of all those who had vanished in this place before him. And as the entity in the water began to rise, its form slowly becoming visible in the dim, flickering light, Aaron took the deepest breath of his life, bracing for confrontation, understanding, and the final revelation that had been waiting for him since the moment he had entered the building, because nothing in his past had prepared him for what was about to unfold. Aaron's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim, flickering light reflecting off the water in the chamber, and though he could finally make out the massive form rising from its murky depths, he felt no relief, only a deeper, more pressing sense of danger and wonder, because the entity, enormous and shifting, seemed to shimmer between solidity and shadow, almost as if it existed partially in another plane. And the water rippled unnaturally with each movement it made, sending a faint vibration through the floor and into Aaron's boots that resonated deep inside his chest. He stepped forward cautiously, the lantern trembling in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows that the entity seemed to absorb or manipulate, bending the light in strange ways that made the symbols on the walls glow softly, faintly, like the heartbeat of the building itself, pulsing in rhythm with the whispers that had guided him here. And for a long moment, all he could do was stand and watch, frozen between terror and fascination, because this thing, whatever it truly was, exuded intelligence, awareness, and an almost tangible curiosity about him, the lone intruder in its world. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to move closer, each movement graceful yet utterly alien, and the water lapped softly against the edges of the chamber as the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chorus of voices, some pleading, some warning, some urging him forward, and Aaron realized he had no choice but to respond, to acknowledge its presence, to act, yet his mind raced with questions. Why had it allowed him to come this far? What exactly did it want from him? And what would happen if he made the wrong move? He edged forward onto a small dry ledge, feeling the symbols beneath his feet vibrate faintly with each step, and with every inch, the entity seemed to grow larger, more defined, yet still impossibly fluid. Its eyes were glowing points where he assumed eyes should be, tracking him with unnerving precision, and in that moment he understood that the whispers were not just guiding him, but teaching him, showing him the rhythm, the rules, the pulse of this ancient, haunted place. Aaron's breath came in shallow gasps as he realized that every decision he had made to this point, the trapdoor, the platform, the spiral passage, had led him here for a reason, and that the chamber, the entity, the whispers, and even the building itself were a single, connected organism, testing him in ways that challenged not just his courage, but his very perception of reality. Yet as he lifted his lantern higher, trying to illuminate more of the room, he caught a subtle movement along the far wall, just beyond the entity, a shadowy figure barely visible, moving independently, suggesting that he was not the only one drawn here, that the building still held secrets he had yet to encounter. And as the water continued to ripple and the whispers rose into a soft, melodic chant, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The undeniable knowledge that the next steps he took could shift the balance between survival and oblivion. Yet he had no choice but to proceed, following the rhythm, following the pulse, following the faint, urgent voice that had brought him this far. And though every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee, he forced himself to step closer, letting the water lap at his boots, letting the cymbals hum beneath him, letting the entity loom and study him, knowing that to stop now would be to surrender to fear, and that the answers, the truth, whatever it was that had been waiting for him in this chamber, lay just ahead in the shadows, in the whispers, in the pulse of the water, and in the enigmatic gaze of the ancient being rising before him, waiting patiently for him to finally understand and act. Aaron stepped cautiously through the shallow water, every movement creating concentric ripples that distorted the reflection of the entity looming before him. And though the glow of his lantern illuminated only a portion of its vast, shifting form, he could feel the rest of it stretching into the darkness, curling and twisting like smoke caught in a slow current. And with each step the whispers grew louder, overlapping, coalescing into words he could almost understand. Phrases like, "You were chosen," and "the balance must be maintained," threading themselves into his mind in rhythms that matched the pulsing vibrations of the platform he had stood on earlier, making his chest tighten and his vision blur slightly. Yet he forced himself to focus, to step steadily, because hesitation, he knew instinctively, would allow the entity, or whatever force controlled it, to dominate him, to consume the courage he had mustered to this point. The chamber itself seemed to react to his presence, the walls subtly breathing, the water shifting as if alive, and the symbols etched into every surface began to glow more brightly, casting their ghostly light across the entity's body, revealing strange, almost runic markings that spiraled and danced across it, wrapping its form in patterns that seemed to convey meaning he couldn't yet grasp, but which stirred an urgent sense of recognition deep within him, a memory he could not place. Aaron's heart hammered as he reached the center of the chamber, the point where the water was deepest and the entity's form loomed largest. And though it didn't move aggressively, it pressed against him with a presence so forceful, so impossibly heavy in its quiet, that it felt like his body itself was bending toward the floor, drawn into the essence of this being, as though the water, the whispers, the symbols, and the entity were all working together to show him the gravity of his task, the importance of the step he was about to take. He could hear a soft, almost musical hum rising from beneath the water, the rhythm syncing perfectly with the entity's pulsing form. And for a moment he considered retreat, thought of all the ways he might turn back, escape to the spiral passage, escape to the surface, escape the nightmare that had consumed this building and everyone before him. But the whisper came again, unmistakably, flowing into his mind as if spoken directly into his thoughts. There is no going back, only forward, only the truth. That single phrase drove him onward, and he took another careful step, water splashing around his ankles, lantern trembling in his hand, illuminating strange etchings on the floor that glowed faintly brighter with each inch he advanced, casting long, quivering shadows along the walls, shadows that twisted and writhed as though alive, moving independently of the entity, yet synchronized with its subtle shifts. The entity's eyes, or glowing focal points where eyes should have been, followed him with an intensity that made his skin prickle and muscles tense. He could feel the intelligence behind those lights, an awareness that extended beyond instinct, beyond instinctual predation, beyond comprehension. And though fear clawed at him like icy fingers, he also sensed patience, the weight of eons of waiting, of observing, of testing, and a strange, paradoxical invitation to understand, to connect, to embrace what had haunted this place for decades. Step by measured step, he advanced toward the deepest part of the water, where the entity's full form began to shimmer with a subtle, undulating glow, revealing features that were vaguely humanoid, yet undeniably alien. A hybrid of shadows, water, and something else, something primordial that felt older than the building, older than the town, older than the very earth around him. Every fiber of Aaron's being screamed to stop, to flee, but he forced himself to keep moving, aware that the whispers were no longer just guiding him. They were testing him, shaping him, pushing him to see, to comprehend, to reach a point of understanding that would determine not only his fate, but perhaps the fate of all who had come before and all who might follow. The water rose slightly with each of his steps, lapping at his knees, at his waist, cold but strangely invigorating, and the entity mirrored him subtly, shifting its form, rippling in the water like a reflection gone rogue, sending vibrations that resonated deep in his chest, in his bones, in his very consciousness, urging him to let go of fear, to trust the rhythm, to move with the pulse of the chamber itself. And then, just as he reached the center of the water, directly beneath the largest glowing symbols on the walls, the whispers sharpened into clarity, forming a single, coherent sentence that echoed through the chamber with impossible volume yet gentle cadence. You have come this far, now you must understand or be consumed. Aaron's legs shook, and his lantern light flickered as the entity rose slightly, water cascading from its form, illuminating patterns that twisted and writhed in ways almost impossible to follow with human eyes. But he felt the meaning in his bones, felt the importance, the weight, the inevitability of what he was being asked to face. And though every instinct screamed to resist, to retreat, to escape, he knew he could not. For the chamber, the shadows, the whispers, the water, and the very entity itself had become a single, unified test, a living, breathing challenge. And the next step he took would carry consequences he could not yet imagine, but could not avoid either. And with one final, shuddering breath, he stepped fully into the center, bracing for whatever revelation awaited, the water swirling around him, the symbols flaring, the whispers rising into a crescendo, and the entity looming like the culmination of all fear, all history, all mystery that had ever occupied the haunted walls of this building, leaving him poised on the edge of discovery, of understanding, of the impossible truth that lay just beyond the shadows. Aaron stood in the center of the water, the entity before him pulsating gently, no longer menacing but patient, almost expectant, and as he allowed himself to breathe deeply, the whispers softened into a single, melodic hum, filling the chamber with a sense of understanding rather than fear. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly one last time, illuminating patterns that made sense in a way they never had before. And he realized the entity was not here to harm him, but to reveal the history of the building, the lost town, and all the secrets it had held for decades. A reminder that knowledge and courage often arrive hand in hand. Slowly, the water receded, leaving the chamber calm, the shadows easing, and Aaron stepped back on a dry ground, feeling lighter, aware that he had faced the unknown and survived, that the whispers, the shadow, and the pulse of the building had been a test of patience, courage, and understanding. As he ascended the spiral passage and emerged into the quiet night above, the town silent, and peaceful once more. He looked back at the building with a new respect, knowing that some mysteries were meant to be encountered, understood, and honored rather than feared. And as he walked away into the soft glow of the moonlight, the gentle hum of the chamber beneath the earth seemed to fade, leaving only calm, only peace, and the quiet satisfaction of having faced the unknown and returned whole.